Rewilding Arcadia, which is a project that we're working in partnership with the Thames Landscape Strategy on, and it's led by them. So without further ado, Jason, over to you.
Hello, everyone. It's very good to be here tonight. Hopefully you can all hear and see me. And if you bear with me, I'm just going to share my screen. Lovely. Colin, could you just let me know through a text whether you can see and hear me okay? Would that be okay? So I'm going to be talking tonight on rewilding in a heritage landscape, which is a talk which Fran asked me to do as part of the Climate Change Week. And it is all to do with a new project that we've got called Rewilding Arcadia, which we launched during lockdown. And it's an absolutely fascinating project, all about how we can adapt the floodplains to make them resilient to climate change. It's about rethinking our floodplains. It's about repurposing them. It's about making them fit for the rest of the 21st century. As a project, we're in phase 1 at the moment. And we started phase 1 of the project. Oh, good grief. September the 6th, we got permission to start, and it's funded the first phase with a grant from DEFRA of £350,000, which is matched from £50,000 by the Environment Agency, £60,000 from the TLS partners through their contributions, and £50,000 from the Department of Work for Pensions. And the first phase is all about to establish how to and agree how the floodplain should evolve to make it resilient to climate change. And so the first phase is all about engagement, consultation, outreach, and the implementation of small demonstration projects. And this is due to finish in March 2023. But before I talk about the Rewilding Arcadia project, I was going to talk a little bit about the Thames Landscape Strategy and the Arcadian Thames. And this is because I don't know who is coming to this type of talk, and I don't know how much you know about the TLS, which is what I'm going to say instead of the Thames Landscape Strategy. And I also don't know how much you know about the Arcadian Thames. Some of you will know loads, others of you will not know that much. So the TLS, we're a vision, we're a strategy, we're a partnership, we are an organisation that is steeped in local knowledge, and we're also a delivery mechanism. We're a partnership of 14 riparian partners, including London Boroughs, Surrey County Council, Historic England, Environment Agency, PLA, Port of London Authority, Wild Parks, and so on. We work very closely with a charity, our charitable arm, the Father Thames Trust, and we work to deliver the strategy itself. Over the last 27 years, we have raised £22 million for conservation work, and we have also managed 400,000 hours of conservation work. So as an organisation, we are quite successful, and we're involved in all sorts of stuff. The first thing we got involved in was Riverside Management. See the slide in the top left of your screen. The Riverside used to be an absolute tip. It really was. That was a normal site on the river 4 or 5 days a week, and we did a big campaign to get the litter cleared. Also, the way that the grass is cut, the meadows are managed, that sort of thing is something which we are very involved with. And trying to find new ways to manage the riverside, be it shire horses or working from a narrowboat. And volunteers, a massive part of what we do. As I managed earlier, 400,000 volunteer hours have been clocked up. So the type of things that we do, well, biodiversity is a huge part of what we do. We delivered 14 hectares of new reed bed, installation of otter holts, delivered over 500 new lights, environmentally friendly lights. And of course, I love the artificial sand martin banks. And you are going to see some pretty state-of-the-art PowerPoint technology tonight. We've also reopened a load of lost views and vistas and restored historic avenues, such as the Ham Avenues. We also have restored and repaired a whole raft of different railings and bollards and fences, and planted new trees and hedgerows. We've also restored and enhanced a whole load of streetscape enhancements. The photos at the top are before and at the bottom is afterwards. A lot of those are derelict open spaces, such as on the left. This was an open space in Brentford. Restored gardens. We've restored all sorts of stuff, and landscapes. This is Richmond Hill that we restored quite a long time ago now. We don't just do delivery of projects on the ground, though. We also have had a big outreach and engagement program to try and get people from all across the community involved and engaged in the river. And it has been a wonderful program over the years. But increasingly, our focus over the last 3 or 4 years has been floodplain adaptation and restoration of the natural floodplain. And we've been working to restore and implement a series of early hits that has pretty much been working towards the Rewilding Arcadia project. And the big project there was the restoration of the Hampton Court water meadows, which was a £500,000 restoration of the meadows down in the home park. It really is a very nice piece of restoration. And we always love taking people over to it. So that's who we are. I think it's important as well to set out what the Arcadian Thames is. Well, it's a rural paradise. It's pretty much what it is. It's a landscape of historic settlements and villages, of historic royal palaces, villas, botanic gardens. It's full of wildlife, and it's a place for Londoners to come and enjoy and escape the hustle and bustle of city life. It's also a fabulous place to live or work. It's a landscape that offers the opportunity to help shape its future. But above all, it's a landscape where humans can get close to nature. It is a countryside in the city. And that makes the Arcadian Thames very special. Sir David Attenborough sums that up better than anyone in the world. The Arcadian Thames provides that most special of urban experiences, one that really makes my heart sing. It is a place where humans, water and wildlife can get close to each other, yet within the confines of the largest metropolis in Europe. That is special. I really must get Sir David to record that for me. So, rewilding in a heritage landscape. Why is this important? And to understand that, I'm afraid you are going to need a bit of a history lesson. It's going to be the quickest history lesson I've ever given on a talk, though. And for that, I'm going to outline how the Arcadian Thames came into being. How did the landscape end up with what we have today? And the answer for that is royal control. The royal family moved here and they started modifying the landscape and the floodplain with their palaces. Next to the palaces, they put their hunting parks, the old deer park, home park, bushy park, and so on. Where the royal family were, the nobility followed them. The aristocrats wanted to be near the seat of power. And following the nobility, well, all the other people that came along with the court. And up and down the river, it became a landscape that was characterized by villas. Where they built their houses and their gardens, they did something quite strange. They joined these up to each other, and they joined the villas up with views, with avenues, with vistas, and something strange happened. And that is that these people who were living here in the 18th century started to look at the riverside in a different way. A series of thinkers moved into the area, such as Alexander Pope, who moved into his villa at Twickenham, and they pretty much caused a revolution. They caused a revolution in thinking about how we think about nature, how we think about wildlife. But this was a very Arcadian revolution, so it was much more of this sort of thing. And what their revolution did was imagine that the ancient world of Greece and Arcadia had been transferred to the Thames. Now that could have all ended up as just a little bit of silly aristocratic fun, but it didn't. And the reason for that, I'm just going to talk about for the next 2 minutes. And the Arcadian Thames became a landscape of revolution. And it was a revolution in gardening, in thinking about nature. And it was put in place by a whole series of motley looking people, the Queen, Countess of Suffolk, and so on. And they transformed the parks and gardens alongside the river. They threw out the old way of doing things, such as this image at the top, the Privy Garden. They threw out the Baroque. It was too old-fashioned. They said it was too French. It was too European. They wanted the new English way of doing things. Good taste was seen in Arcadia as being natural, And that was a huge, huge shift in the way that we think about the landscape. The landscape continued to evolve, eventually being opened up to the people. As up until the Victorian times, this landscape was a very privileged private landscape. But bit by bit, from the 1840s onwards, Arcadia was democratized and eventually saved for the nation at the end of the Victorian times, with the view from Richmond Hill and the saving of the parks and gardens alongside the river. Move into the 20th century, and the landscape continued to be a playground for London. It really was the place to go and unwind. And we ended up with this incredible landscape, the largest connected open space in the capital. But we have got a realization over the last, I suppose, 20 years that climate change and flood risk models are predicting that the Arcadian Thames is at increasing risk from flooding. Time is now running out if we're going to implement a strategy to make our floodplains resilient. And that is what Rewilding Arcadia is all about. It is how we can keep the character of the past whilst in a historic landscape, but really trying to implement something special through a rewilding project. It's all about nature-based solutions, and that is a huge shift in thinking for the floodplain. As the floodplain has been managed in a very different way, a much more controlled way, I would say for the last 300 or 400 years. The project was launched by Sir David Attenborough at our 25th anniversary at City Hall a couple of years ago. Unfortunately, we forgot to give him anything, so I have this incredible computer graphic there to illustrate it, but we did thank him because he is our wonderful patron. It's about the floodplain, and it is a project all about the floodplain. It is a project about the Arcadian floodplain, and that is the floodplain between Weybridge and, I suppose, Chiswick. But before I talk about that, I just want to try and point something out, that floodplains have changed constantly. People think that floodplains are pretty set in stone, but they're not. Even the tidal limit has changed. This is an image of London in Roman times, and it showed, that's London Bridge in the top left. And it shows just how different the river was in its natural state. The river has been highly modified. The wild river has been tamed. We all know that the tidal river ends at Teddington Lock, for example. But if you lived in Tudor times, you would have said the tidal river ended at London Bridge, because the tide couldn't get up through the old through the bridge. So it pretty much ended up in the city. Once London Bridge was pulled down, the tidal limit extended upstream on some good tides all the way up to Staines. Here's the London Stone. So if you lived in Georgia in England, you would have thought the tidal limit was up there. We say that the limit is now Molesey Lock, because on a good flood, the river overtops Teddington Lock and goes up to this weir. And I'm sure that it's going to change again over time. So the river is changing. But the biggest change has been the modifications to the natural floodplain. So much of the floodplain has been built on, the river has been canalised, flood defences have gone up, large areas are protected, and since the 1980s, we've got the Thames Barrier. And this photo shows it wonderfully. It shows the different layers and the brick and the stone and the concrete going up this river wall. It's Rotherhithe, I think. And it shows how the river walls and the flood defences have been built up over the last 100 years, usually in response to a flood. And it's just as well they have, because the area in red here would show the area that is in the floodplain and would flood on a big tide. So we need these flood defences. These flood defences and the modifications to the river have allowed London to grow. But what it has done is seen a loss in the relationship between humans, Londoners, and their floodplain. We have lost a lot of that relationship that we used to have with the river, with nature, with wildlife, and particularly the dynamism and wildness of the river. When there's a high tide, for example, air and the flood alerts go out, it makes headline news. But what we're actually witnessing is something completely natural and something which isn't really a big flood. The Environment Agency don't think the river has had a big flood since 1884, for example. And all this modification has led to us thinking about the floodplain in a very different way. This is Petersham Meadows, of course, but is it a wet or is it a dry habitat? It should be a wet habitat. It should be a floodplain, but it has been managed for the last at least 30 years, as if not a lot longer, as a dry environment. To a large extent, this hasn't been a problem. When the high tides do come in, when we do get a little bit of a flood, it's a bit of fun. Most of the businesses in the floodplain are used to it. Most of the householders are used to it. So it hasn't been too much of a problem. But increasingly, what these high tides and floods are doing, though, is starting to alter the landscape. It's cutting off our use of it. The river is telling us that it wants its floodplain back. And the climate emergency has really altered the balance between the river, flooding and floodplain. And we have to act now if we're going to make this floodplain resilient. Flood risk is increasing year on year. As a general rule, what is wet now is likely to get a lot wetter in the future, and we need to start planning for these changes. So, how has flood risk changed and why? Well, first then is rising sea levels, and that is increasing flood risk on the tidal Thames. I absolutely adore this image. It's on an app called Flood Risk Maps, and you can put in different sea level rise scenarios and go into 1 meter squares for the whole of the world. And this shows the UK how much of the UK would be underwater if all the ice caps melted and the worst case scenario of 49 meters happened. And you can see that places like Nottingham, Sheffield, Leicester, Oxford are all seaside resorts now. It's not going to happen. But what is going to happen is uncertain. We don't know how high the sea is going to rise. It is uncertain. So is the amount of flash flooding down the river. So is the amount of fluvial flooding. And this is an important part of what has to be planned for when we're planning the Rewilding Arcadia project and how we move our floodplains forward. We do not know what is going to happen in the future. It depends on a whole series of factors, not least what goes on in Glasgow at the moment. It could make all the difference on whether we have that 49 meter rise or whether we have a 1 meter rise. And that has a huge impact on the river. And I always use our old chairperson's house, Lord Watson's house on Cholmondeley Walk and River, to try and illustrate this. Here, there's Lord Watson on the right, our old chairman, and there's his lovely house, Cholmondeley House. And here's the high tide coming in. And this is a high tide on a normal neap tide. This new level is a spring tide. And you can see that it's only halfway up that wall behind him. And the wall is the flood defence in this case. And those black gates in the wall are flood defence gates. So everything is happy. Even Lord Watson, it's only up to his chin. But if there was no Thames Barrier, and I will talk about this in a bit, then that spring tide would rise above the flood defences and up to Lord Watson's nose. And if we then go to the likely sea level rise that will happen over the next 100 years, we're now at Lord Watson's forehead, and more worryingly for him, it's in his upstairs bedrooms. And if we then go to the highest level of sea level rise, which could happen over the next 100 years, we are now right up almost to Lord Watson's attic. The thing here is that we just don't know. It's uncertain. But what we do know is that sea level rise will increase the level of the floods in the River Thames, sea level somewhere between 91 centimetres and 4 metres. Just release Lord Watson from the flood. And this is happening for a number of reasons. One of it is increased rainfall. Rainfall patterns have changed a lot over the last 20 years. We now get shorter periods of intense rainfall that all falls onto an increasingly concreted landscape and enters the Thames very quickly. This rises water levels and it has changed flooding patterns. It's changed as well from what's coming downstream for a number of reasons, and flood risk coming down to the Arcadian Thames it could increase to anything up to 40% in peak flow coming over the weir at Teddington. That is a huge increase in the amount of water coming down our way, and it all has to go somewhere. Now, this has all been mapped and modelled by the Environment Agency, and a whole series of different things and measures have been put in place to help manage this flood risk. And of course, the biggest thing that we've got are the walls and the Thames Barrier. And this is the embankment. You can see behind the boat there, you can see the embankment wall. That is the flood defence in central London. And that flood defence pretty much straddles the River Thames right the way up to Kew Gardens. Interesting little fact on the embankment, if you look at the lions, there's some lions there with mooring rins on them. If the water reaches the nose of the lions on the Thames embankment, that means the Thames Barrier has to be closed. If you notice the water going above the lions' noses, you know they've messed up somehow on the closure of the Thames Barrier, and I've always been told head for the high ground then. But something interesting happens when we move above Kew. The flood defences start to get a lot broader. The flood defences are set much further back from the river. And if you take Petersham Meadows as an example, most people, if asked, would imagine that that low river wall that runs alongside Petersham Meadows is the flood defence, but it's not. That is simply an interim flood defence that was put in after the 1953 floods. The flood defence is actually a contour line set much further back in the meadow at the statutory flood defence height. And a lot of people find that very hard to believe. So effectively, most of Petersham Meadows is situated within the functioning floodplain. And that means that we do have a very wide floodplain. It's one of the widest, if not the widest, functioning floodplain in London. And it is a floodplain that is very susceptible to a flood. And if you go back to those uncertainties that I talked about earlier, there are a lot of uncertainties in the Arcadian flood. And that is because our neck of the woods from Molesey down to Chiswick is at the place where the tidal river meets the fluvial river. So it is at risk from both a tidal surge coming up the river or a fluvial flood coming down the river, or it is at risk of both. And that's the one that we have to be really worried about. What happens if there's a big flood coming down the river that meets a big high tide coming up the river? And that is one of the reasons why we get so many flood alerts issued for this area. Most of which, it has to be said, can be managed, and they are largely managed by the Thames Barrier. And the Thames Barrier is used all the time to protect our neck of the woods. And this is one of my favourite slides. This shows the way that how many times the Thames Barrier has been shut since it was opened. But it breaks it down into two different mechanisms, because the Thames Barrier can actually be used for two totally different reasons. It can be used either to protect central London from a tidal surge coming up the river, or it can be used to protect the Arcadian fields at the top of the tideway from a high tide meeting a big flood coming down the river. And the green bars are, when that's happened, the green bars show the amount of times that it's been used for that operation to save us really from getting flooded rather than central London. And you can see that it's been used a lot more for that purpose than to help reduce the flood risk in central London from a tidal surge. But the one thing that it can't do is do both at once. It cannot be used to both protect central London from a flood and to protect us up here at the top of the tideway from a high tide meeting a fluvial flood. A decision has to be made by the Environment Agency on which operation they're going to choose. And as you can imagine, they are going to choose the protection of central London. Now, we know that the number of times that the Thames Barrier can be shut to protect us at the top of the tideway is going to reduce. And that is because all the models are showing that it's going to be needed increasingly to protect central London from a tidal surge or a tidal surge coming up the river. And it will not be able to be used for us. And the Environment Agency are predicting that the use of the Thames Barrier to protect the Arcadian Thames from a fluvial flood coinciding with a high tide will be phased out by 2035. This is the biggest and most fundamental change that our river is facing, and it has huge implications. And that is best demonstrated to you on a flood risk map. And I'm going to focus in on just one little area, the old deer park up here, to try and illustrate that. So if you go into that area, here is the flood area. And to explain that, the red line at the bottom is the A316, the red dot is the Kins Observatory, and that big splodge of red running through the middle is the River Thames. So what do the different areas of blue mean? Well, we've got the hashed blue area. That is the area that is protected by the Thames Barrier. So that area can be protected by the Thames Barrier by using it, which effectively means that the outer part of that is the statutory flood defence. But what it does mean is that everything within that purple dashed line on the inside of the hatched area, the lines located by a red arrow, is in fact functioning floodplain, because it's not an area which the Environment Agency considers can be protected by the Thames Barrier. And it's that area there, up and down the river, which is going to be at increasing risk as the operation of the Thames Barrier which decreases, fluvial floods increase, tidal surges increase, and sea level rises. And it's a big old area. I mean, the place I've chosen here hasn't got many buildings in, only a few golf course buildings, the Kins Observatory, I say only, the Kins Observatory, but further upstream, there are more buildings that are affected. But what is in that are some of the best wildlife sites in London, some of the most historic landscapes, the Thames Path, all sorts of recreational areas. We have to start thinking about things in a different way. So why is it a problem? Well, it's a problem for those reasons that I've just said. And a lot of people have their heads in the sand over this. They're unaware of the increase in flood risk or don't want to be aware of it. And up and down the Arcadian Thames, we're going to find that wildlife, historic landscapes and recreation will be affected as floods and droughts increase. And this comes back to that fundamental problem again, that we manage our floodplain as a dry environment rather than a wet environment. It is simply not ready yet for climate change. Now, a lot of the solutions to this are set out in various planning documents and flood risk documents for the Thames, such as TE2100, which is the flood risk plan for the tidal Thames, the River Thames Basin Management Plan, which is to look at how we manage the catchment, the Your Tidal Thames Partnership, so on. There are a lot of these strategic projects there, but a lot of them are quite top down, and a lot of these flood risk management strategies rely on engineered solutions, and they have an emphasis on protecting homes and infrastructure, such as schools, power stations, that sort of thing. And you can see there's a list here of the different measures that can be introduced and encouraged by the Environment Agency to decrease flood risk, such as new tidal barrages and barriers, adaptation of existing barriers and so on. But all those ones in red will not help the Arcadian Thames. Only the ones in green, sustainable urban drainage and reforestation and slowing upstream flow, will have a difference outside our area. And within our area, only weir modification and living with water are the two policy measures which can be implemented to reduce flood risk in our part of the world. And so things that happen up and down the river outside our area are important. And these little chaps, the beavers, they may have a part to play in helping to slow upstream flow, so actually keep the waters in the headwaters. Reforestation of areas such as the Berkshire Downs and the Chilterns could help to store water and slowly release it, so we don't get that 40% peak flow coming down the river. And also measures in the outer estuary to increase the area of the floodplain there through managed retreat are going to have a huge impact on the water level that comes up the river towards us. But in our area, the options are limited. And hopefully you will all agree that building a blooming great wall along the river edge is not something we want to do in our area. It would totally destroy the character of everything we love about the river. We're going to have to think about managing flood risk in a different way. We've looked about increasing local flood capacity, and the Environment Agency, for example, looked at the potential to lower the land on Ham lands, for example. This is about 3 years ago. But the actual gain, the flood risk gain there was about 2 centimetres, and the decision was taken that the benefit of that was not outweighed by the cost, or was it the other way around? The cost outweighed the benefit. That's the way around. The cost outweighed the benefit. And it was quite rightly thrown out. It's not really a viable option. Blue-greening in the floodplain. Again, that's not something which is going to make a huge difference. Outside the floodplain, yes, but within the floodplain, no. So pretty much the policy which DEFRA and the Environment Agency are looking for us to use to manage our floodplains can be summarised as living with water. And here on the right is lovely Bill Coley from Richmond Bridge Boathouse. He lives with water every day. When the flood comes in, he just puts his flood boards up and takes a break and waits for the flood water to go back out down the river, and off he gets on with his job. And there's other measures that can be put in place. Emergency planning, for example, temporary barriers, community resilience, redesigning our houses in a different way. So those buildings that are within the floodplain are resilient to floodplains. But most importantly, the measure which we're going to have to look at is floodplain restoration. And that involves what's called nature-based solutions. Or at least it does in what we're proposing. We would like our floodplains to be restored in a way that uses nature-based solutions as their guide. And that is the essence of Rewilding Arcadia. And I think we can do it here because we have people who are still in touch with their river and their natural world. I would argue more than anywhere else in London. And we do have very forward-looking authorities here who are willing to embrace these ideas. And so I think that Rewilding Arcadia is a mechanism which could actually work to manage that flood risk within this area between the purple dotted line, i.e. the functioning floodplain. A way of making our floodplain resilient for the future. A way of reconnecting people with the lost floodplain and with nature and the natural cycles of the Thames. All of this is important stuff. Rewilding, though, is not about the reintroduction of species, that sort of thing. The rewilding that we're talking about has a very specific purpose. So I've got the wolf here. It's not about reintroducing wolves. It can reintroduce some species, such as sand martins on this artificial sand martin bank, and otters. The work that we've done to put the otter holts in has seen otters return to this part of the floodplain. What we're talking about is for water, and for water to be allowed to be our guide. So what the river is doing guides how the floodplain is managed. And that is a fundamental shift in what's happened in the past. Up until now, we have tried to control water. It's the opposite now, it's the flip side. We want the water and increase in flood risk to really control what we are doing. And this is quite revolutionary within an urban environment on the Thames. Oh, there comes the flood again. Let's just move that little otter up. Right, so what is Rewilding Arcadia? Rewilding Arcadia then proposes measures to create fabulous new wetlands in areas that are already at risk of from flooding. And that's important. We're not trying to create additional areas and additional capacity for flooding. We are looking at how we manage those areas that are already at risk. And where these places are at risk, as well as putting new wild areas in, we want them to make them accessible for the public to enjoy and to understand that natural floodplain. And that's going to mean a lot of wildlife and nature conservation enhancements. A big and important one will be backwater creation, wetland habitats. And importantly, these need to be linked to the main channel of the river, as most backwaters at the moment along the Arcadian Thames are totally separate from the river. And when we get to the river edge, those river edges need to be naturalised, such as this lovely piece of work that took place at Walton. And that is really important for all sorts of different species, but particularly fish. And fish need these backwaters and these natural river edges if they are going to survive into the future. As droughts increase and we get sunnier days and warmer days, they need the shade of the trees to take refuge. In floods, they need to be able to swim from the main channel into our nice new backwaters so that they don't just get swept out to sea. And it's also going to involve putting things in the river as refuges for them. And I've just put this little, I think it's an old hi-fi, just to remind you all that a lot of the stuff in the bottom of the river, it acts as an artificial reef because the river has been cleared so much now that the fish and the invertebrates have absolutely nowhere to go. Quite important, that little type of habitat. And what we're looking for in the end is a mosaic of interconnected habitats where a diverse range of wildlife can flourish and importantly move about in. And there's all sorts of different ways we can do that. I'm not going to go through this one now because we haven't got time. But another interesting thing that could be incorporated into Rewilding Arcadia are fish passes. And this is for fish to move up the river where there's a break in their passage through a weir or a river wall, that sort of thing. And this is an idea which is being floated, and this is Teddington Lock. And at the moment, Teddington Lock is quite a big barrier to the movement of fish. There's a big project to reintroduce the Atlantic sturgeon, which is one of the flagship species. It wouldn't be able to get up the river and flourish in the Thames because of Teddington Lock. Something radical needs to happen if that's going to happen. And this is a new fish pass on the Severn, and it's been designed with sturgeon in mind. There's nothing like it on the Thames. It could be something which Rewilding Arcadia looks at. If we are serious about letting nature be our guide and letting these species move about, then this is the type of option that we have to start thinking about. These incredible fish passes to allow all the species to move up and down on. And this needs to be based on the science. And I've put this photo, and this is actually my wife on the right, and Renata, and this was the very first bivalve survey back in 2003 that we carried out on the River Thames in our area to find out what's going on at the bottom of the river during the draw-off. And it'll be taking place on Monday and Tuesday next year. It's now the most important piece of science probably on the Thames about the mussels and the bivalves on the bottom, and it's showing how the river is changing, and it's all helping to inform what we do. But as I said earlier, it's not just wildlife. If we're going to do this, we need to make certain that these landscapes are resilient for people. And when the high tides start to come in, they come in quickly and they overtop the towpath in a matter of minutes. It can be dangerous, but it can also stay there for quite a long time, which means the towpath can't be used for 2 or 3 hours. And for some reason, the big spin tides always come up the River Thames between 4 o'clock and 7 o'clock at night. Sorry, 3 o'clock and 7 o'clock at night. So that means that the school routes, commuting, that sort of thing, are broken by the flood coming up. Top image shows at low tide. Bottom image shows the same towpath 2 hours after those people were walking along the river. It blocks all recreational use. And we've trialled with a project we had 10 years ago, London's Arcadia, installing some dry routes to see how they worked. And on the whole, they've worked well. They have allowed people to use and navigate and safely get away from the towpath when the tide comes up. Top left shows the image at low tide. Bottom left shows the image at high tide. They have worked. The one thing we have learned is we need to use recycled plastic to make them because the salt water does rot the wood rather quickly. So it has made that section of the floodplain accessible in all but the worst floods, and we were able to construct them in a way so they were associated with a whole series of wetlands. But dry routes don't have to be as formal as that. They could be simple boardwalks, they could be grassy bunds. There's a whole series of different measures that could be appropriate to the landscape that could be put in place. And there are all sorts of additional benefits that Rewilding Arcadia could look at. For example, urban runoff. reed beds can be used to filter out the pollutions that come from the runoff. Where we put a reed bed in, not only does it filter out the pollutants that are coming off the roads, but it can also act as a carbon sink. There's a lot of evidence that is showing that a reed bed can actually store more carbon than a forest, and that is absolutely crucial in the fight against climate change. We can also use Rewilding Arcadia to look at how we manage problems such as flotsam and jetsam, and the perception of safety walking along the river, and also how we manage the river in the long term. Different ways of managing it could be put in place that are a lot more sustainable. Volunteering opportunities would need to be key to it. And we can use rewilding as a mechanism to build resilience at those at-risk communities, particularly people who live above Teddington Lock. And we can use it to restore historic features, such as some of the views and the vistas along the river. I'm going to flick that one, because one of the things that came from lockdown was a huge desire for us to weave into the project the idea of natural intimacy with the river, and this is to create quiet spaces where people can just sit and have their own space within nature. And those quiet spaces were at a premium during lockdown because the river was being so well used. So as we move the project forward, we would like to put in the idea of having these quieter spaces, and they are very important for mental well-being and also for the physical health of both people that live around here and people who use the landscape. So the first phase, as I mentioned, is all about talking to people, listening to people, finding out whether people like our approach, finding out what people want us to do. And we need to reach out to a whole series of different diverse voices to make this happen. And so we have, and we actually appointed, and she should be on here now, hello Laura, a new education and outreach officer who's going to help us put together this plan over the next 18 months. And we have all sorts of different ways that we're going to reach out to people to try and gather your views about how the project should move forward to phase 2 when we start to implement the project. During this time, we will be carrying out a few demonstration projects, and this is the last 5 minutes of the talk now, just to talk about the type of projects that could take place with Rewilding Arcadia in the future. Oh, before I move on to that though, the demonstration projects, we are looking to make them very volunteer heavy in the way that they're implemented, and we've teamed up with Habitats and Heritage. And we've teamed up with Fran, who you saw earlier, and she is now going to be the volunteer coordinator for the Rewilding Arcadia project for 2 days a week. So it's also shown partnership and interactions between the various organisations along the river. Back to the longer term project, we've chosen 6 areas along the river where we're going to look at prioritising some of the Rewilding Arcadia schemes. There is Desborough Island, way up the river in Weybridge, Hurst Park, the Home Park Water Meadows at Hampton Court, Canby Gardens at Kingston, the Hammond Petersham Towpath, and the Old Deer Park, Syon Park, and Brentford. They're the 6 areas, and I'm just going to focus on one of those areas, the Old Deer Park, to give you a flavour of the type of things that over the next 18 months we'll be looking at, to see what people think of it. Do they want a different approach? All that sort of thing. And the Old Deer Park is a fabulous place to do this sort of thing, because we know that Kew is a place that is very at risk from flooding. And if we look at how the landscape has changed here, that's the LiDAR map, give you your bearings. There's the River Thames running through it, the Brent coming in. The green dot is St Anne's Church, the yellow dot's the Palm House, and the red dot is the King's Observatory. In its natural form, the river was very different here. And it was a very wide river, the dark blue area, with areas of sort of shingle banks, these white sort of islands in the river, and then the green bloods, they are areas of willow carr, and there was a very wide floodplain. would have been much more similar to this in its natural state before humans started to modify it. And it has a very wide floodplain, as we saw earlier. So it's an absolutely perfect place to look at. And the floods, when they come, can be pretty devastating there. This is the flood that pretty much covers the whole of the Royal Mid-Surrey Golf Course. And even on sort of a weekly level, the lower part of the old deer park, everyone can see how that flood risk is increasing. And the image on the right shows the grassland on the left in a low tide scenario, and on the right in a high tide scenario. And not only is it damaging the grass, but it also stops any use of the parkland. So the first thing that we are going to do in all our projects is survey work. And in the case of the old deer park, we've already started this, and we teamed up with London Borough of Richmond, who funded an ecological survey of the towpath and the habitat associated with it. And we got some really good data from that about the ecology of the towpath, in particular the importance of the wet woodland in that area, which is of national importance, and the importance of being located so close to the site of special scientific interest on the other side of the river at Syon Park. The next thing which we are doing is a hydrological survey. As we know that there is a flood risk in the old deer park, we know that the water gets in, we know the flood water goes out, but we have no idea what it's really doing. We don't know whether it's coming up from the ground, how it's moving, all that sort of thing. So a series of wells have been dug across the old deer park. There's one on the right hand side, a little blue tube, you probably can't see it, and we've teamed up with a whole team of volunteers who are carrying out a big citizen science project over the next 12 months, and they are measuring the water levels, measuring the groundwater, which that information will be used alongside other wells and monitors in the deer park that are measuring how high the flood water is, and so on. And so by the end of this process, we hope to know exactly what the water is doing and in the old deer park, as by understanding the hydrology, we can understand what the river is saying it wants us to do. There are other things that we need to measure as well and survey before we can do anything. One is an invertebrate survey for the German hairy snail and the tulip door snail, and we also need to carry out a saprophilic invertebrate survey to find out what's going on in the fungi in the dead wood. Once we've got all that, we should be in quite a good place to move on to the next stage, and this comes back to the title of the talk, Historic Landscapes, about what is under the ground. As we know that the old deer park is jam full of some really important archaeology, but we don't really know what archaeology is down there because it has never been surveyed. So that's another big survey that needs to take place. And I quite like this image on the left. It's the funeral of Anne of Bohemia, and she is more than likely leaving the charter house that was on the old deer park, somewhere between the King's Observatory and the river. So the view in the background may just be the very first painting of the river in the London Borough of Richmond upon Thames. But the point here is we don't know what's underneath it. And then since then, there have been so many different layers of changes. We need to survey it. And this is something we noticed a couple of days ago on the riverside. It's more than likely associated with George II's palace at Richmond Lodge, but we just don't know. So the survey has identified a whole series of different zones for management. Zone 1 is a zone where habitat creation and recreation can take place. Zone 2 is the wet woodland, which is so special we need to really just leave it as it is. Zone 3 is an area for habitat creation, wet woodland creation, and so on. Zone 4 is the dry woodland along the river, and how do we manage that? Needs improving. Before we do anything, as I said, though, we're going to have to talk to people, find out what you think, link with other projects such as the proposals that are going on to link the car park down to the riverside and onto Askell House, and work with all the partners such as the London Borough of Richmond, Crown Estate, and of course the Royal Mid-Surrey Golf Course. We also need to put in place a series of early hits. And one of them for me, if you look at these are the volunteers who were out there last week, but you can see that right next to them are the sedges, but behind them is Himalayan balsam, and it is absolutely everywhere in there. And that's going to have to be something that we look at immediately starting next summer, is getting the volunteers out there, picking that up. And that can be a way to actually engage with people and get people safely into the floodable areas so that they can start to understand the issues in there. So the type of things in the future we can do: management plans for the wet woodland. How do we retain the dead wood without blocking the channel? How do we manage water levels in the ha-ha? How do we increase the areas of wetland? How do we increase the areas of standing waters? All these things could be possible in those areas. And these are the very last slides now, just to illustrate how that could happen in one area. And this is the zone 1. It's an area that's defined by the old ha-ha along the edge, ancient ha-ha. It's an area where climate change has already taken hold. This shows an area that can't be cut with the grass because it is so sodden. This is the area we're looking at. It's a 5-hectare area of amenity grassland right on the edge of Richmond. It's an area where nature can be our guide because the river is telling us it wants it back. This blue splodge shows the area that floods on the spring tides now. This area in yellow, these are the areas that the London Borough of Richmond can no longer cut because it is simply too wet. And these light blue splodges are areas where standing water is present now pretty much for most of the year. So that's it now. And this is a very, very expensive computer graphic that I knocked up this morning to show you the type of thing that could happen. It is for illustrative purposes only, and it could happen anywhere along the towpath. It's just that I have chosen this area to illustrate it as an example. And this is the first slide, shows a low tide example, and it shows the type of things we could do. We could put wetland habitat in, swales, a pond, a big area of reed bed, a boardwalk. Importantly, these new wetland habitats would be linked to the main channel of the river. We could have any wetland habitat slowly morphing as we move up the flood defence into the dry grass. A large area of wet woodland, the most endangered and special habitat in Greater London, of which the only place in Greater London that wet woodland creation is possible is the top of the tideway, i.e. Ham, Petersham, Twickenham and Kew. That's the only place tidal wet woodland can be put, and it's something that we have to think of in Rewilding Arcadia. And then all this can be done in a way which respects the heritage, simply by maintaining that historic vista of the King's Observatory that goes through the park. If we look at how that would change during the neap tide, those swales, which are the sort of grey areas there, they become flooded on the neap tide. And this is quite an important thing because it is an area that changes throughout the tidal phase. And then on the high spring tide, the whole area floods. It's not that we are flooding it, it's that we are managing that landscape with nature as our guide so that it can function both in high and neap and a low tide. And all this would be linked to improvements to the footpath network, and new footpaths could be put through. These are the grey lines that are running through it, linked to the existing network of footpaths, which are the dotted grey lines. As you can see, that would work perfectly on low tide. Most of them would work on the neap tides. They would be the main route through on the spring tide. So even on the biggest tides, the navigation of that area is still possible. And it could look absolutely stunning with areas of reed bed, areas of standing water, lovely new paths going through it, areas of marginal planting, boardwalks going off into the larger areas, viewing platforms, that sort of thing. These places where people can have that intimacy with nature that they crave would all have to be done so that they were dog friendly, though, I think, in London, because that would be an important consideration. And importantly, these wetland areas, it doesn't matter if there's a drought, and we know that droughts are going to increase with climate change as well. But we also know that these wetland areas are sustained by the action of the tide coming up. Importantly, that water that's coming up is not is fresh enough for it to be classed as a freshwater habitat. So we can put freshwater species in there. Any reed beds can have an additional benefit, such as it could filter out the pollution, the diffuse pollution, the runoff that comes down from the A316, the bypass. And that is one of the most, we know that from the GLA, that's one of the most polluting roads as it goes through the old Deer Park for the River Thames in London. All that runoff could be go down through the reed beds, and the water at the end of it would be quite pure, and the reeds would take all that pollution off. And we could use this freshwater habitat creation at the old Deer Park to offset some of the loss of freshwater habitats in the outer estuary. And this is important because it could bring large amounts of funding in to do this. As I mentioned, historic features could be restored, such as the opening up of the vistas. And we're going to actually do this one and do some habitat creation in the Ha-Ha there this winter. And also this winter, as one of the demonstration projects, we're going to start looking at the nature-based solutions to manage the riverside. And this was work that was done about 15 years ago, and look at willow spiraling along the river. In the long term, much broader projects could take place, such as riverbank naturalisation to the concrete revetments on both sides of the river, and the possible reintroduction of the Isleworth Ferry to really get a landscape there that is resilient to climate change. And this is the last but one slide. I hope you've got a flavour about what the sort of thing that Rewilding Arcadia can do. It's a project that's now started. It's a project that's going to be running for the next 18 months, as I said. It's a project that has come about as a direct result of the climate emergency. And I was going to finish with just by leaving you a message from Sir David Attenborough, because he sums it up better than anyone else. Thank you for listening to me.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jason, for that really informative, really interesting talk. So I'm now going to open it up for questions. If anyone has any questions, do either raise your hand using the little emote button, or do pop it in the chat.
Can I answer Roger's question or point?
Yes, go for it.
That was he said that he thought a lot of this was quite managed, and that Rewilding was much more about not managing things. And I tried to counter that earlier on by saying the thing that we have to understand with Rewilding Arcadia, because of the type of environment that it is that it's the water. That is the thing that we're rewilding with, and we're using water as the guide, and we're letting the water really do what it wants. And then we're managing the whole landscape around what the water, or we could manage the whole floodplain around the water. And that is quite unique. And I think that approach has to be taken in an urban environment.
Brilliant. And we've got a, hold on, I'll just unmute you. We've got a question over here.
Governor.
Oh, hello, thank you. And I should declare myself as being a local councillor, a Twickenham Riverside councillor. I live in this landscape that you're talking about. I'm also the chair of the Environment Committee in Richmond, and the chair of the Executive Review Board. So I've heard all this before, but I just want to commend you on the dynamic way you've presented it again, and I always learn something new. We have a lot of shared objectives, and we come from a different direction, but our objectives are that we respect, I think, the history, but also embrace and try and work with nature to protect ourselves rather than against it. And that's that nature-based angle rather than the engineering angle. But I do have a quite a specific question, and maybe you're more knowledgeable about this than me, and that's often when talking to people about climate change and what we can do, we talk about tree planting, and that is obviously something positive we can do. But are you suggesting actually that some landscapes actually could offer us more than simply planting trees, such as when you're talking about the old Deer Park? Is it just about planting trees, or are there other ways to manage our landscape that can also help in the fight against climate change?
Thank you for that. I would say yes. Others might disagree, but there is a lot of evidence that a reed bed stores more carbon, for example, than a wood, and it has other additional benefits. And I think the key in a floodplain is the mosaic of habitats. So we plant both woodland, but we don't just plant woodland, we do it in a way that is specific for a wet environment. And it goes back to that point about tidal wet woodland being the most endangered habitat in the whole of Greater London. And the only place that we can get tidal wet woodland to grow in Greater London is at the top of the tideway. And so if we're taking the old deer park as an example, if we're going to plant woodland on the floodplain area, it needs to be planted in a way that it is tidal wet woodland. And so we plant the species appropriate for that, which are not often the species that you would plant, because it's the willows and the alders, that sort of thing. So not the big oaks and the limes and everything else that we may think we need to plant. And then we have that mosaic of habitats with the reed beds, with the marginal plants. And so it doesn't need to have every area planted with something which is going to sink the carbon, because we also need that diversity of species there. If we're going to have that wild and that more natural landscape, it needs everything functioning within that habitat. I don't know if that answers your question, but I would say no, there are better things, or things that are just as good to plant as trees in the floodplain.
And just to add on to what Jason said, it's not just the climate crisis, it's also the biodiversity crisis that we have to be cautious of as well. So creating that mosaic effect is really important in all of these solutions that we're striving for. Sorry, I muted myself. There's another question here, just a small question about, what did you mean by blue greening?
Blue greening. Blue greening is a phrase. There's lots of phrases that sort of mean the same thing. Blue greening is it can mean sustainable urban drainage, for example. So it's when rain falls on somebody's roof, when it falls in your front garden, when it falls on the road, that there are measures put in place so to try and reduce how much of that water eventually goes into the combined sewers or into the sewer network and then into the river. So you put in place, and these can be miles away from the river but have a huge impact on the river landscape, that if the rain falls on my roof, for example, I live in a thatched cottage. Rain falls on my roof, the thatch soaks it up and slowly drips on your head every time you leave that house for the next 24 hours. But that is blue greening. It's a way of releasing that rain slowly back into the ground. So that rain is not going onto the road, it's not going into the gutters, it's not going then into the river. And swales are a very good example, and it's pretty normal now in new developments, but so much more needs to take place if it's going to make a difference. Permeable surfaces are a massive one as well. I hope that's answered the question.
Oh, another question here. Let me just unmute you.
I think Councillor Needham-Watts was going, because the Richmond Council are pretty hot on this, so Councillor Needham-Watts might want to add something.
Well, it's I sort of was holding myself back because I'm keen to hear questions from other people as well. It was just that point about the surface water, and in your talk earlier on, you described very well the tidal surges combining with all the water flowing down from Oxfordshire and so on, which combines in our area to create difficult situations. But that's not the only thing. I'm really sorry. My husband is scraping on some difficult pan in the kitchen. It's really, and I'm hoping you can't hear it, but this is my life. That's exacerbated by climate change bringing intense periods of prolonged rainfall, and we've seen that in July this year. Where we had localized flash flooding, which is surface water, which is the additional type of flooding, and that all seeks to find its way either into the sewers or into the river. And I just wondered if you could contextualize that a little bit, that it's not just about the rainfall and which goes into the river and manifests as fluvial or river surges, and not just the tidal surge, but also we're going to be contemplating what falls down on our hard surfacing in our local area. And there's perhaps a connection there between Rewilding Arcadia, which is the river, and rewilding our own front gardens, our own parks, our street surfaces, which are impermeable often, and how it all ties together. It's a rambling kind of observation rather than a question, I'm afraid, but you've probably got a comment that's helpful.
No, only maybe do what I've done, because you've said everything. I've actually left my house and gone into my parents' house to give this presentation because my family makes so much noise in the background. But yes, it's exactly right, and I have full confidence that Richmond Council will do what's needed to help reduce the problem with the blue-green. And it's in your climate change strategy.
So does anyone else have any questions? Either do raise your hand or pop it in the chat. Just to give you a few moments to see if anyone's popping anything there. While we wait for that, I'm just going to do a bit of a roundup. So as I mentioned in the beginning, this event is part of Richmond Climate Week. We are 4 days into Richmond Climate Week on our Heritage Day today. Tomorrow is transport and air quality, so we've got lots of information that we're going to be sharing all about the council's actions on air quality, and we've got some fantastic events. We've got stepping out of the family car events online, as well as some other activities happening, and hopefully some of you might have even had the chance to try a cargo bike earlier in the week. And this weekend, we've got some fantastic in-person events. We've got an open forum this Saturday where we're hoping people can join us at Orleans House Gallery to have their say and ask their questions. So we'll be joined with a few of the council departments, so the policy team, the waste team, the transport team, as well as the air quality team as well. But we're also going to be there with some fantastic community groups and some charities as well to find out what they're already doing to help our climate and our local community as well. So we do hope you can join us at that event. Come down and have your say and ask your questions and just see the fantastic work that's already being done, as well as letting us know what you might want to see done in your area. There's also then on Sunday the chance to get practically involved in your spaces, both in green spaces through work at Ham Lands, doing a nature conservation practical day and some bulb planting, and also cleaning up on that area that Jason's just talked about. So we've got our draw off litter pick, where access to the Thames foreshore and the riverbank that we don't normally see, we can access because of those sluice gates that are open, so we can get to areas and find things like plastic cups and nylon rope and things like that that are detrimental to the health of our riverbeds. So we've got lots of activities going on practically that people can also get involved with, and we also have sort of a celebratory event at the end of Climate Week, bringing experts from across climate, different topics of climate change, from circular economy and consumerism to areas about energy and talks about sustainability as well. So we've got different experts. We've got people from Kew, people from the Grantham Institute, and also joined by Councillor Needham Watts on our panel event on Sunday at 3 o'clock at the Exchange. So if that's something you want to get involved with, I believe my colleague Colin has popped the links in the chat, so do check them out and do engage with all of the Climate Week projects that are going ahead. So I can't see any further. There's just one comment here to say, just a note that surface water runoff is also another reason for not doing walls as a solution, as it keeps water out of the river as much as in, which, yeah, is a fantastic point. So I can't see any other comments. So if we don't have anything else, anything to add there, Jason?
Only that last comment. I can't see who it was from. Was it Becky?
Yeah.
That was the approach that Richmond, Virginia Council took, and they put these incredible walls up along the river that all the flood water that comes down from the hurricanes just goes straight to the middle of the town, and they've had catastrophic flooding because the surface water that falls in Richmond itself, it can't get into the river because it can't get through the walls, and it just backs up behind the walls. So it's a massive consideration. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure talking to you all.
Thank you for your time, Jason, and thank you for all of your time for coming and listening, and all of your questions as well. Hope you have a lovely rest of your evening, everyone.